Hello, this is Eliseo Rodriguez, and this is the Arian Orthodox Church. We're going to be looking at a little bit of church history on Arianism and trying to get a little bit of a better understanding of what's going on in the early church and the beginning of Arianism and the controversy. So that's what we'll be looking at. So, how's it going? Hope you guys had a good couple of days off on the weekend, if you had days off on the weekend. We're going to be looking at church history. We're going to be looking at the ecclesiastical history of Sozomenus. This is from the Nicene and post-Nicene Fathers. Philip Schaff is the editor. In chapter 14, the Arian heresy, its origin, its progress, and the contention which it occasioned among the bishops is the title of the chapter in the church histories, in his church histories. And so we're going to look at this and try to get a grasp of what happened during the Arian controversy. I want you to see a couple of things that are really important, because you hear a lot of stories about the way Arianism turned into the way it became and the way it came and all of that. And we need to look at it objectively and see exactly what happened. So we're going to start reading. Although, as we have shown, religion was in a flourishing condition at this period, yet the churches were disturbed by sore contentions, for under the pretext of piety and of seeking the more perfect discovery of God, certain questions were agitated which had not till then been examined. Arius was the originator of these disputations. He was a presbyter of the church at Alexandria in Egypt, and was at first a zealous thinker about doctrine, and upheld the innovations of Miletus. So let's just stop right there. So what was going on with Miletus is that he was a bishop, and during the persecution of the church, there were a lot of Christians who decided that they were going to not they renounced Christ instead of being killed, instead of being martyred. And so Miletus said, you know what, that's not cool. That's not the church. You guys can't accept these people back into the church who have left the church. It's not right. So he pretty much said, I'm not going to eat communion with you guys. I'm not going to do anything with any Christian that pretty much wasn't martyred or didn't, suffer for Christ. If you turned away from Christ, you're not allowed to have communion with us, and you shouldn't have communion in the church. And so he was pretty much a staunch anti-Arian anybody who backslid. So if you were a backslider, he would not accept you. And I don't know if a regular backsliding, but for sure if you backslid and just renounced Christ, then for sure he was going to, he wouldn't agree with you. So we have to understand where he's coming from in that area. So that's what he was about. And it says that Arius was a zealous thinker about doctrine and upheld, he agreed with Miletus as far as you can't just accept the Christians in who have rejected, who didn't martyr and instead, gave up, renounced Christ. He said Arius and Miletus both believed that it was not cool and that you can't be a Christian and do that. So it says, eventually, however, he abandoned this later opinion and was ordained deacon by Peter, Bishop of Alexandria, who afterwards, so before we go any further, so to be accepted into the church proper, right, the larger church, because Miletus was like, I'm not going to be eating communion with you guys. We are separate from you guys. We're not part of you, you church who accepts whoever, rejects Christ. He separated his church from the regular church. And so it looks like Arius said, well, you know what? I'm going to accept forgiveness for these other people that rejected Christ and renounced Christ, under penalty of death or whatever. And we're going to, so Arius decided he was going to join the bigger church instead of what Miletus was saying. And so, first of all, it's really interesting because I don't know how the apostles would feel about Christians who wouldn't die like Christ died for them if they were put in a position to be killed and they did not. I don't know how the apostles would see that. I don't know if that's love for Jesus and appreciation for what Jesus did for them. They're not willing to do the same for Christ. I don't know. That's a more controversial subject, I think. But you can see the line of staunch Christianity. They were all persecuted back then, and this church is barely coming out of persecution now. And so now that they're coming out of persecution, they still remember who rejected Christ, and they're not, they weren't accepting it. Some of them weren't. At least Miletus' church wasn't. And he was ordaining people who were not in his area, and the other bishops were kind of mad about that and saying, you can't do that. And they're from my area, blah, blah, blah. So there's a lot of controversy going on with Miletus. But so Arius was ordained a deacon by Peter, who's the bishop of Alexandria, who afterwards cast him out of the church because when Peter anathemized the zealots of Miletus and rejected their baptism, Arius assailed him for these acts. So when Peter decided he was going to say that anybody who didn't, who was with Miletus and agreed with him, their baptisms and all of their ordaining and all that stuff is just junk, it's trash, it's not real, because he won't accept these other Christians who rejected, who renounced Christ. Arius was not happy with that, so he's going to voice his opinion. Obviously, he's changed his view, but he's also saying, hey, you can't just say that their baptisms are no good and say that all of this is no good just because you don't agree with him there. And who knows if Peter or any of these bishops or any of these higher people in the church were people who rejected Christ under persecution. They might have been. We don't know if Bishop Peter was one of those people who who renounced Christ, or if any of the leadership in the church in Alexandria renounced Christ, and that's why Miletus didn't want to be part of them. But either way, Arius didn't agree with that, so he spoke up to Peter, and the bishop, the saying was through Ignatius that you don't question the bishop, you treat him as if he was Jesus, which is improper. That's the wrong way to look at bishops, honestly. Anybody in church leadership, I don't care who they are, they're not Jesus on earth. We all have Jesus and we all represent Jesus, but not everything that comes out of someone's mouth is Jesus. And so we need to understand that. They didn't understand that back then. So, so Arius was willing to talk, to correct Peter and say, I don't agree with you on that. This is not cool. And could not be restrained in quietness. So he couldn't quiet Arius down. Arius would not shut up about this. And so Peter eventually is martyred. So at least he was willing to be martyred and not shy away like the rest. Arius asked forgiveness of Achilles and was restored to his office as deacon and afterwards elevated to presbyter afterwards. Afterwards, Alexander, who was the next bishop, Alexander also held him in high repute. So Arius is, people are like, Arius is a good guy. We need to, keep him. He's important. So it's not like Arius was some idiot retard that nobody agreed with. Even Alexander said, this is a very important person in our church. So Alexander also held him in high repute since he was most expert logician or logical thinker. So for it was said that he was not lacking in such knowledge. So he was very logical. He had a lot of logical explanations and stuff like that about Christianity, about theology. So they said he was important. So he fell into absurd discourses. Now this is talking about that he went into arguing with people about things that were, they're saying, absurd, things you shouldn't talk about, discourses, so that he had the audacity to preach in the church what no one before him had ever suggested. So he's saying that he had these conversations that were not no one had ever heard these conversations, namely that the Son of God was made out of that which had no prior existence. So in other words, Arius said that Jesus came from somewheres other than the Father's substance. That's the main point that Arius was saying. That nothing else was created. So since Jesus is the first creation, there's nothing, and he's not taken from God's substance, right? God didn't take some substance out of himself and then fashion Jesus out of it. Arius is saying, no, Jesus was made originally. That God made Jesus originally, not out of something. Like Adam was made out of the earth. He took some earth, some dust, and made, fashioned his body and then breathed the breath of life into him. So Adam was taken out of the earth, which makes sense because he eats out of everything that's made out of the earth, and he survives through the water and through the plants that grow out of the earth. And so he's part of the earthly system because he's made out of that earth. So it makes sense that Adam survives on earth because he's kind of made out of earth, so he's kind of part of that makeup. But Jesus was not made out of, first of all, Jesus wasn't made out of God. God didn't take some of himself and make Jesus. So what else was there? There was nothing else. So God made Jesus originally out of nothing. God just made him after his own kind. So there's nothing that God used to build Jesus. Let me put it that way. There was no other material to make Jesus with. He just made Jesus out of nothing. And so that's one of the problems that they had with understanding about God and whether he was taken out of nothing or whether he was taken out of God. Because the Trinitarians are assuming that God used some of himself to create Jesus. And if that's the case, then that's why he's co-eternal and co-consubstantial, and that's why he's all this other stuff. And so that's why if you say that Jesus was taken out of God's substance, and I've talked to Seventh-day Adventists like Solomon Rodriguez about this, where he believes that that Jesus was taken out of substance from God and made and therefore he's divine and all this other stuff. The problem with that is that it's a slippery slope that leads down to Trinitarianism. And so when he studies Ellen White, and you look at the conversations from Ellen White, you see that they said that Jesus was made out of the substance of the Father, and then you know, he was the Son of God and everything else. Everything else is Arian-like, except for the part where he is taken out of the Father. And if you look at Seventh-day Adventists now, they all kind of went full circle and went into Trinitarianism. The reason they go into Trinitarianism is because if you say that Jesus was taken out of substance from the Father and is made, you will always eventually, or the common the path that takes you to will eventually lead you back to the Trinity, because he's taken from substance from the Father. So all of those things that the Father has is believed to come from his substance from the Father, and therefore he is part of those characteristics of the Father. So that's what Arius was saying that he's not. He was made out of nothing. He was made originally out of nothing, made originally, that God made a copy of himself, or a copy of himself, or someone after his own kind. That's what he made, his child, but not out of part of God himself. So Son was made out of that which had no prior existence, that was a period of time in which he existed not. That is, as possessing free will, he was capable of vice and virtue. So what Arius was saying was that there was a period in time in which the Son did not exist. Nothing of Jesus existed. Not even the substance of Jesus existed. So for people to say that, yes, Jesus existed in the Father, the substance that God used to make Jesus out of existed in the Father, so Jesus has always existed, that kind of stuff, that's not, and he said that to prove that Jesus didn't exist at any time. Not even the substance that he was in the Father, because God didn't use himself for that. Another thing that Arius said was that God cannot be divided. That God is not, you can't cut God, you can't divide God into pieces. God is who he is, and he can't be taken from. So that was his explanation, that you can't do that. That's not part of the explanation. So he's saying that there was a period of time in which Jesus did not exist, and that he possessed free will. So this is another thing. God is perfect and holy and never does anything wrong. He is always living in holiness and operating in holiness. And Jesus had free will. In other words, just like Adam could choose to fall into sin, just like the devil could choose to fall into sin, just like any angel literally can fall into sin or decide to fall into sin, any being besides God can conceivably decide to sin at any point in time, because they are possessing free will, that they all have a choice. And God has a choice too, but he never is unholy. So Jesus has free will, had free will. It's not like he couldn't have done anything. It's not like a robot where he cannot sin at all. God cannot sin, but that's because he's holy. So Jesus possessed free will. He was capable of sin. He was capable of sin. It's not saying that he did sin, but he was saying it was capable for him to have sinned. It was capable of him to have, to be virtuous or to be in sin. So, and let me clarify, God can do anything he wants to, but he is holy. He never will sin. I don't know if that's considered free will or not. That's kind of a controversial statement. So let me just reel that back in. God is holy no matter what. God can do anything he wants to. There's things that he will not do because he's holy. And so God is incapable of sinning because he is holy. So that, I don't know how the word free will would apply in that area. So I'm not going to try to go there. I just want to smooth that over. So Jesus is capable of sin or not sinning. And that was a revelation to the church back then, saying, wow, how is that possible? And it makes sense to make this argument because it says that Jesus was tempted. God cannot be tempted. So God cannot be tempted because what are you going to tempt God with? You know, if you have if you have a billionaire, let's say a billionaire is sitting in front of you and you want to get him to do something and you're going to try to offer him like $5 to get him to do something, right? If you were to try to tempt a billionaire with $5 to do something, he's going to look at you funny because he doesn't need that. There's probably not enough amount of money that can get him to do something against his own personal convictions for $5 or for any amount of money if you're not a billionaire yourself. So the point is that you can't tempt somebody with money when they have all the money in the world, right? And so with God, you can't tempt God with anything because God owns everything already. God is in control of everything. So how are you going to tempt him with anything? There's nothing that God needs. There's nothing that God wants. There's nothing that God lacks. So you cannot tempt God, but Jesus can be tempted. Why? Because Jesus isn't God. And to be tempted means that you don't have everything and that there's things that you aspire to, things that you want. And so the devil is going to tempt you out of the desires of your heart. So the devil knows what you want, what are the desires of your heart, and he will tempt you with those things. So Jesus, if we look at the temptations that Jesus was given through the devil, you can find out what are the desires of Christ's heart. He tried to tempt him with all the kingdoms of the world. Well, Jesus knows that God is going to give him all the kingdoms of the world. God's going to give him everything. He's going to inherit everything. The devil tried to tempt him with all the kingdoms of the earth. He's trying to promise what God promises to Jesus. He's trying to offer if he just bows down to the devil. Jesus wants those things. He has to be given those things, and Jesus has to be obedient and patient with God about getting those things. But the devil was trying to tempt him into bowing down to him to try to get those things. So that was a desire that Christ wants to have everything that God is promising him. And the devil was trying to give him an opportunity to fail at that and sin and try to gain that without God. But Jesus didn't pick that, right? Obviously, Jesus is very obedient, which is why God chose him and God made him. So then you have he was hungry, and he said, if you're hungry, make these stones bread, right? I mean, he's trying to tempt him by the lust of his body. Very hungry, 40 days of fasting, and God is saying, you don't do anything unless I tell you. So if the devil tells him to make these stones bread, if the devil's telling Jesus to do this and he does it, if he were to do it and follow that suggestion, then he's doing what the devil told him to do instead of what God told him to do for his own need. And that was a trick. If Jesus would have done that, then he would have been listening to the devil's suggestion on what to do and how to use his power, which would have been an abuse of power because God gave him those abilities. It's kind of like when the water out of the rock, right, with Moses. He said, knock on the rock and water will come out. And he knocked on it twice when he was mad. And obviously water still came out, but he abused that, what God had given him to do. So the issue is, he was tempting him with the lust of his flesh, obviously being very hungry, and trying to use what God had given him for his own purpose instead of what God wants. And on and on and on. So it's proving that Jesus is not God, because there's nothing that, you can't tempt God that way. Can you imagine someone trying to tempt God and saying, look, I will give you all the kingdoms of the world if you bow down to me? And tell God Almighty that. That's a joke. You know what I mean? there's no temptation there. God's going to be like, I already own everything. Nice try, but not nice try because I already own everything. That's like not even funny. That's kind of the thing. So when Jesus is tempted, it shows that Jesus had the possibility of sinning, but he didn't. So that's what Arius is saying here, that Jesus had free will and that he was capable of vice and virtue and that he was created. So he was created, he came into existence and made. So he said created and made. To these, many other similar assertions were added as he went. Forward into the arguments and the details of inquiry, those who heard these doctrines advanced, blamed Alexander for not opposing the innovations at variance with doctrine. So Arius is teaching this. He's teaching it and teaching it and teaching it. And some of them are saying, Alexander, why are you not telling Arius to stop teaching this? This is absurd. It's not right. You can't teach this kind of stuff. Jesus, they didn't, some of the church, and I'm saying some of the church, not all of the church, just some of the church didn't agree with Arius. So some of them came to Alexander, the bishop of Alexandria, and said, look, we don't understand why you're not stopping him from teaching this. Now, the reason I believe that Alexander was not opposing Arius is because he agreed. There's a letter, actually a couple of letters from Arius to Alexander, and he reminds Alexander, you taught us this very same thing that you're kind of, you're persecuting us on this very issue, but you used to teach the same thing. So Alexander never responds and says, you're a liar. I never taught that. He never says that. So it's interesting that he never comes back with a letter that says, no, you're wrong. I didn't teach that. So I don't see Arius writing a letter to the bishop reminding him that he used to teach the same thing and it be a lie. You would think that people would point that out, but they haven't. No one has said anything about it. So it says, but this bishop deemed it more advisable to leave each party to the free discussion of doubtful topics. So Alexander's like, let them kind of try to hash this out. Let's see what happens. And I think what was happening was that the bishop of Alexandria, Alexander, was really trying to let Arius kind of develop this into the church so that they could accept it because it was sound doctrine. So it says, so that by persuasion rather than by force, they might cease from contention. Hence he sat down as a judge with some of his clergy. So during this kind of debate about Christ and the Bible and what does it say about Jesus being temptable and Jesus not existing and always being part of God or not being part of God and always in existence or not always in existence and all of that started in Alexandria. And so the bishop sat down as a judge among two different parties. Now he let the church essentially be divided, and the church was, half of the church was arguing for Trinitarianism or consubstantiality. They didn't actually develop Trinitarianism until later, but they had this consubstantial idea, and then on this other side they had this non-consubstantial idea, and he allowed them to start debating each other in Alexandria in the church. And him and a couple of others were just going to be judges and listen and see who's going to be right. So, and led both sides into a discussion, but it happened on this occasion, as is generally the case in a strife of words, that each party claimed the victory. So as they're, complaining and everything else, and Alexander saying, well, what about this? What about that? What about this scripture? What about that? Trying to get them to get into harmony. When they walk away from the discussion at the church and they go home, they're like, yeah, we won. We said this and Alexander said that, and everyone thought that they won. And they would tell their people, yeah, it was a big debate, but we won. And that's like any debate nowadays. You go listen to any of the debates on Socinianism Arianism or Socinianism and Trinitarianism or whatever. And you come up with, everyone walks away saying that they won. And honestly, that no debate has ever solved anything, honestly. So it didn't work, what Bishop Alexander was trying to do. So Arius defended his assertions, but the others contended that the Son is consubstantial and co-eternal with the Father. The council was convened a second time, so they had this one big debate that split the church in half, essentially. Half the church is debating for and the other one against. And then, so the council was convened a second time. So this is the second church council, just the sole church council, not the whole church council. A second time, and the same points contested. So they started debating against the same thing. But they came to no agreement amongst themselves. So they still were divided. So at the very beginning, let's just start right here. At the very beginning, Arius was teaching what he was teaching. It's not true that he came up with the idea. Lucian, he learned from Lucian. There are several other important church figures that were taught by Lucian, and he was very, very well known, and he was martyred as well. There's a lot of controversy on whether or not the whole church believed it or not, but let's just look at the church in Alexandria, the church that Bishop Alexander is looking at or is presiding over. Half of the church is for and half of the church is against. So does that mean that Arius was the only one in his church teaching that believed this? No. It's absolutely true that the church is divided in Alexandria. Half the church believed one way, the other half, and we don't know how many believed this way or how many believed that way to know if it was even half. There might have been, it actually, and we're gonna read that. Actually, there were more on Arius' side than there were not on Arius' side. So Arius' side was the majority in the church. Even though we're gonna see what happens, but when it gets finished, you're going to find out that actually Arius' side is actually the majority in the church, and the minority is the people who don't agree with Arius. So it says, they came to no agreement amongst themselves during the debate. Alexander seemed inclined first to one party, then to the other. So let's look at the terminology here. It says, Alexander, who is a bishop of Alexandria, seemed to incline first to one party and then to the other. So let's just do chronologically the words in here, first and then. So first he was on one side and then he was on the other side. So that means that he was inclined, Alexander was inclined, at the beginning he was an Arian. Do you see what that says? That's what that means right there. That Alexander, at the beginning, was an Arian. So he was first inclined to one side. So that means that he was on Arius' side to begin with. And then to the other. Because we know at the very end, he even convened the Council of Nicaea and stayed on the consubstantial side. But he wasn't always on the consubstantial side. So when people want to tell you that Arius changed his view and all of a sudden became this radical, that's not true. What's true? What's true is that the bishop in Alexandria went from being an Arian, right? That's what it says here. Alexander seemed to incline first to one party, that would be the Arian party, and then to the other, because the other one, the last one that he was with and the one he died with was the consubstantial side. So that means that first he was on the Arian side. So that's why he allowed, first of all, that's why he considered Arius to be important, and that's why he valued Arius, and that he was a logical thinker and a very zealous teacher. And that's why Alexander preserved him, and that's why he allowed him to teach, and that's why he didn't stop him, and that's why he just continued to allow him to do his thing, to teach those, the other part of the church, or the small group of church that of church members who didn't agree with Arius so they could understand. And then he put them together and tried to get them to talk amongst each other and develop this understanding. But what happens is that Alexander, who is at first an Arian, ends up agreeing or being taught and being influenced by the opposing party. So who's the one who switched sides? Who's the one who changed their view? Did Arius just change his view into a new view and then start teaching his new view, and that's what happened? And he turned into this new group of Christians and tried to overthrow the church? Is that what happened? No. Actually, the description that people are trying to give to Arius, that Arius was that he changed his doctrine, that he came up with this new idea and he started to try to, proclaim it all over the world, and that it was spreading like wildfire and all that. That's not true. That's not true. We're reading it right now. What really happened is that what they're trying to describe for Arius is what actually happened with Alexander. Alexander came up with a new teaching. Alexander started to fight for this new teaching, and he gained people, and his idea spread like wildfire because he's a bishop and you're not supposed to question the bishop. So they all said, yeah, we agree with the bishop, of course, because he's the bishop and this is a priest. So automatically everybody just said, yeah, whatever the bishop says, that's what I'm saying. I don't know what they're talking about, but I'm agreeing with the bishop regardless. And then when they found out later on, they're like, oh, never mind. We're not with the bishop. That's why it says that later on, the Nicene Council pretty much ended up being nothing, because the church became full Arian and they kicked out all the consubstantial church members out, and Athanasius, which is Alexander's henchman, and kind of excommunicated all of them and kicked them out of the church and out of the kingdom, actually. So that's what really happened. Not that Arius changed his view and he got a few people and he started spreading this lie everywhere. In actuality, Alexander is the one who changed his view and started to spread his view around, and people believed it, and it spread like wildfire. That's what happened. So who introduced the new doctrine? Who changed the stance? Who tried to change the doctrine? Alexander, by following these other people's argumentation and not what he originally had. So, what's the truth? That narration, that story that Arius came up with something new and threw it all out, all that, total lie. We're looking at it here. Totally not true. So it says, we'll read it one more time. Alexander seemed inclined first to one party and then to the other. Finally, however, he declared himself in favor of those who affirmed that the Son was consubstantial and co-eternal with the Father, and he commanded Arius to receive this doctrine and to reject his former opinions. So at the end, Alexander says, look, I'm going to switch sides, you switch sides too, and we're all going to be happy, okay? Well, his former Arius, however, would not be persuaded to compliance. And first of all, you need to think about this. Arius was of the view that you do not renounce Christ, you get martyred. He was on that Miletist side. And so now you have where they're saying you need to abandon your view and follow after what we're saying. And that's absolutely against the character of Arius, because obviously you're supposed to be martyred for your belief and not change your belief. That's what Arius is believing. That's Arius' stance. You die for your belief. You don't change it. Alexander, he changed his view. But Arius is like, no, I don't change my view for nobody. You kill me, that's all. And so he is of that older generation, and obviously he was an older man than the rest of them. He's of that older generation that said, you know what, I die for my belief. I don't get told what to believe. So Alexander's trying to tell somebody of that generation, hey, you need to change your view. That's not going to happen. So compliance, and many of the bishops and clergy considered his statement of doctrine to be correct. Alexander therefore rejected him and the clergy who concurred with him. So what does it say? Let me go back here where we're missing something. So Arius, however, would not be persuaded to compliance. So Arius could not be persuaded to change his stance. And many of the bishops and clergy considered his statement of doctrine to be correct. So now we're looking at the church, right? And this is talking about bishops. Bishops are people who are over the entire church. So the church in Alexandria, and let's say in Egypt, in a large area, a bishop is over a huge area, not just a little town or one little church. He's over a huge area. So Alexander is a bishop over all of his region. But it says, and many of the bishops and clergy considered Arius' statement of doctrine to be correct. So that means that not just Alexander changed his view. We got that part already. But the other bishops in this world, they agreed with Arius. So not just the little people in the church. We're talking about bishops all over the world. The world, the church world. They all, many of them, it says many of them, agreed with Arius. Many bishops, many clergy agreed with Arius. So who was the majority after Alexander decided to change his view and switch over to this heretical view? Then it gets checked, right? Who's got the majority of the church? Well, Arius does. More bishops, just Alexander is on the side of the consubstantial Christians. Everybody else, all of the other bishops, all of the other clergy, most of them are Arian. They agree with Arius. They're saying, I don't know about this, Alexander. I think you're making a mistake. So Alexander therefore rejected him and the clergy who concurred with him in the sentiment from the church. So in his church, he couldn't, reject the other bishops. They're just as equally high as he is. But he could get his church members and banish them and reject them and eject them. And that's what he did. He kicked them out of the church and said, look, you guys are out of here. Even though it's a majority of his church, even though, there's so much support from bishops outside of his region, Alexander doesn't care. He kicks out the majority of these Christians out. You're out. And he's left with a smaller congregation. So Alexander therefore rejected him and the clergy who concurred with him in sentiment from the church. Those of the parish of Alexander who had embraced his opinions were the presbyters. These are the priests, and I'm not going to name them. You can see that. And the deacons are these guys. Now, and so these, how many is it? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, at least 11 deacons. I'm sorry, let's see, 11 members of the church hierarchy. So you have the priests, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 priests, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, at least 5 deacons. So you have, I don't know how many are in a church or a diocese or whatever, but this many priests and this many deacons. Many of the people likewise sided with them. So many of the church people, so now we're talking about lay men, regular church members, sided with them because they imagined their doctrines to be of God. So most of the people in the church, regular people, not the priests, not the deacons, but the regular people, many of the people believed that what Arius believed was the doctrine of God. And then it says, others, as frequently happens in similar cases, because they believed them to have been ill-treated and unjustly excommunicated. So then after those people who believed that they were right and that this was the teaching of God that Arius was teaching, after they were kicked out, after the deacons were kicked out, after the presbyters, the priests were kicked out, some of the people who were watching all of this said, well, I'm leaving too because I don't think that it's right that you guys kick these guys out. I agree. I don't think that it's something worthy of kicking them out, so I'm leaving. I may not agree with them, but I'm leaving too because you guys are acting absolutely out of turn. So, being the state of affairs at Alexandria, the patricians of Arius deemed it prudent to seek the favor of the bishops of other cities. So there's pretty much half the church, or if not more, is kicked out of the church now, and they're like, now what do we do? So they're going to start petitioning the bishops, the many bishops who already agree with them, to start talking to Alexander to straighten him out, because he's going out of hand. He's accepting foreign doctrine. He's switched his side, and now he's trying to teach this new doctrine, and he's kicking us out. This is what's happening. We've got a rogue bishop. So, of the other cities, sent legations to them. They sent a written statement of their doctrines to them, requesting them that if they considered such sentiments to be of God, they would signify to Alexander that he ought not to molest them, but that if they disapproved of the doctrines, they should teach them what opinions were necessary to be held. So they said, look, we're going to send you guys letters, we're going to send you guys envoys of our people, and they're going to tell you what we believe. We're going to write down what we believe and what we believe is correct and biblical. And you guys, if you agree with us, talk to Alexander and tell him to stop kicking us out of the church and stop, being mean to us and not allowing us to be part of the church. Or if we're wrong and this is not the right way to believe, then teach us the right way to believe then. Tell us what we're supposed to believe. So this precaution was of no little advantage to them, for their tenets became thus universally disseminated, and the questions they had started became matters of debate among all the bishops. All the bishops started talking about, well, what is this? Is it true? Is it right? What is the proper view? Let's start talking about this. So this microcosm of this debate that was going on in the Church of Alexandria is now happening church-wide. Worldwide, all the bishops are talking and saying, let's figure out the answer to this, because Bishop Alexander picks this, and this is a crisis because half this church, if not more than half of this church, is being kicked out because Alexander doesn't agree with them. And we already know that most of the bishops have already agreed with Arius. So some wrote to Alexander entreating him not to receive the partitions of Arius into communion unless they repudiated their opinions. So some of them said, no, you need to make them repent first, and then they can come back. While others wrote to urge a contrary line of conduct. When Alexander perceived that many who were revered by the appearance of good conduct and weighty by persuasiveness and eloquence held with the party of Arius. So when Alexander starts seeing that not just regular old unknown bishops are agreeing with Arius, but more prominent bishops who are a big deal. Bishops, obviously, like Eusebius of Caesarea. So he's the bishop of Israel, the bishop of Nicomedia. These other bishops that are big deals, have huge churches way bigger than his, are finding out and are agreeing with Arius. He's starting to see that he might have chosen wrong. So when Alexander perceived that many who were revered by the appearance of good conduct and weighty by the persuasiveness of eloquence held with the party of Arius, and particularly Eusebius, president of the church of Nicomedia, a man of considerable learning and held in high repute at the palace, he wrote to the bishops of every church desiring them not to hold communion with them. So this started what Alexander started actively saying, I don't want any bishops talking to these guys. I don't want anybody starting to communicate with Arius and all these, because he was seeing that he was losing the battle. He was seeing that the church actually didn't agree with him, and that he was on a different line. Now, he was trying to introduce a new doctrine, and he was seeing that he was starting to look a little foolish to the rest of the very more popular bishops, and he started to say, I really need you guys to stop talking to these guys. I really want you guys not to talk to Arius and these people, because he was trying to sever that communication, because obviously Arius they were in agreement with Arius. Many of the bishops were in agreement. Some of them weren't, and some of them were. Some of the bishops, and we can look at some of this later on, some of the bishops were on the side of Alexander only because he's a bishop. That's it. They said, look, you got to listen to the bishop, follow the bishop. I just take it in some other way. Don't believe that it's consubstantial. Do whatever, but don't argue with the bishop. You're not supposed to argue. So some of the people that were on Alexander's side were only on his side because he was a bishop and not because they agreed. And then you had more prominent people who were absolutely on Arius' side. So, long story short, what happened was that Arius did not change his view. Arius did not introduce a new view. Alexander changed his view. He turned into a teacher of some new heretical doctrine, and everyone that supported him, half of them supported him because he was just a bishop, and that was the rule, that you follow the bishop, and the other half supported him because they agreed with him. And most of the church in Alexandria, his own church, and all the bishops in the universe, most of them were on Arius' side. So the church essentially was predominantly Arius' side, and Alexander was a lone bishop with a few friends trying to teach this new doctrine, trying to bring that new doctrine in, that consubstantial doctrine. So when you hear the story about Arius introducing something, him and his friends, and trying to make, that is not what happened. Alexander is the one who introduced new ideas into the church, and that's what really happened. That's what really happened. Hope you guys have a great week. Bye.